In this lesson, we'll finish up looking at connective tissues by looking at the fluid connective tissues and then the supporting connective tissues. So let's start with the fluid connective tissues. The two fluid connective tissues are blood and lymph. And in both of these tissues, the ground substance is watery, right? It's going to be a watery ground substance. So in blood, the watery ground substance or matrix is referred to as plasma, right? In clinical medicine and anatomy, we don't typically talk about the watery matrix of blood. We call it the plasma. And this plasma actually has cells that are suspended in it. They float in it. And these we call the formed elements. And the three formed elements I'd like you to know for now are the erythrocytes, which are just very simply the red blood cells. And their general function is to transport blood gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Mostly oxygen, just a little bit of carbon dioxide. The second formed element are the leukocytes, which we commonly call white blood cells. And think of the leukocytes as our defenders, right? They're going to defend the body from infection and disease. They may do it by phagocytosis, right, where they do cellular eating, or they may produce antibodies, that type of thing. The third formed element, right, kind of floating in the plasma, are the platelets. And their job basically is what we call hemostasis. Hemostasis means to stop bleeding. And so all three of these cells, the erythrocytes, the leukocytes, and the platelets, are going to be suspended, right? They're kind of floating in this plasma. And so here's what they look like. Here we can see some erythrocytes. These are kind of like a disc. They're not a round cell. They're like a frisbee. And you can see they're a little bit like sagging in the middle. The reason for that is they actually lose their nucleus in some of the organelles. So they kind of look like they remind me of a frisbee rather than a round cell, a complete sphere. Here's the leukocytes. You don't need to be able to identify these at this point as far as what they look like. That's something that we do in future classes. But just to kind of show you some of the leukocytes, these are what we call monocytes. These are the biggest of the leukocytes. These actually convert into macrophages, which are extremely phagocytic cells. Here's some lymphocytes. They produce antibodies. And then I call these guys the phils, right? There's eosinophil, neutrophil, and basophil. Eosinophil is really good for attacking some of the bigger invaders like parasites and worms that may come into the body. Neutrophils are very phagocytic cells. These are the cells that we actually see when you see pus in an infection. And then the basophil is going to produce heparin and histamine. Those are the important chemicals of inflammation, right? We need inflammation as part of healing, right? So these are going to release those chemicals for us. Here's the platelets. Now, platelets themselves are just fragments of a cell that kind of explodes in the bone marrow. And since these are just fragments of this cell that exploded, they don't have their own nucleus, right? They don't have their own organelles. And they roughly, live, 9 to 12 days or so, and then they get recycled. And these are the ones, again, that are involved in hemostasis, which is blood clotting. Okay, so that's it for the blood. The lymph is a fluid that actually lives in our lymph system. You guys probably have heard of lymph nodes. We actually have lymph vessels that are very similar to, capillaries and arteries and veins, that type of thing. So what is lymph? So in our tissues, where our blood capillaries are, plasma will leak out of the capillary and then go into the tissue spaces. We need to reabsorb that fluid, otherwise we would be swollen. All of our extremities, our face, everything would, all our tissues would have a fluid. And you may have heard of a condition called edema. So what prevents edema is these lymph vessels that kind of suck up that fluid that has leaked out of the capillaries. Then that fluid goes in, and I just put here very generally lymphatic vessels. And these lymphatic vessels will return the lymph now back to the bloodstream. But along the way, the lymph actually goes through lymph nodes, and in the lymph nodes, the lymph is actually filtered. We have white blood cells in there that help to monitor the lymph, and hopefully the lymph, by the time it gets back into the bloodstream, right, is more clean than it was when it was in the tissue spaces. So that's basically what lymph is. It's fluid that has leaked out of the capillaries, right? We now call it interstitial fluid, and that goes into the lymph vessels, which is returned back to the bloodstream. Right, so that you discuss much more in future A&P classes. Okay, so let's finish up connective tissues by looking at the support connective tissues. The two supporting connective tissues are cartilage and bone. And if you think about it, our cartilage and bone is really our framework. It's supporting the body. So let's start with cartilage. Cartilage provides shock absorption and protection. If you look at where cartilage is, you'll kind of get that impression. Just it's located in strategic places to do shock absorption and protection. Now here the matrix is not going to be watery. Instead, it's kind of like a firm gel. It contains these chemicals called polysaccharide derivatives. You may have heard of chondroitin sulfate, glucosamine sulfate. Sometimes people supplement with these to strengthen their connective tissues such as cartilage. Now, the cartilage actually contains cells that are embedded in the matrix. These are called chondrocytes. Whenever you see the root chondro, think cartilage, and we know cyte means cell. Okay, now these cells in the matrix live in these little chambers, these little cavities called lacuna. So it's like a little indentation in the matrix, and that allows the cartilage cell to live in it. One of the other things about cartilage is it's kind of unique. It is avascular, meaning that it doesn't have direct blood supply. So basically, it's going to get its nutrients and get rid of waste products by diffusing through the matrix into the area that's around the cartilage. The reason that cartilage doesn't produce or doesn't have a blood supply, they produce these chemicals known as angiogenesis factor. Anti means against, angio means blood vessel, and genesis means formation. And that actually discourages formation of blood vessels. All right, so that's the reason. But the cartilage does survive by again diffusing the nutrients and waste products through the matrix. This is also, just from a clinical note, one of the reasons when people do have cartilage damage, let's say you tear cartilage or you have arthritis, the reason it doesn't ever really get better is because it doesn't have a good blood supply. In order for a tissue to heal, it needs to have a good blood supply. Right? So that's one of the problems with cartilage. It doesn't have a good blood supply, and as a result, it doesn't heal. The other thing about cartilage, I've actually mentioned this before in previous lessons. Cartilage has a covering around it. It kind of reminds me like a saran wrap. It's a dense, irregular connective tissue known as the perichondrium. Right? Peri means around, like a perimeter, and then chondro means cartilage, right? So this is this tissue that surrounds the cartilage, and if you were to dissect it, you could actually separate it, peel it apart. It has an outer, what we call fibrous layer, that gives the cartilage some support and protection, and then it has an inner cellular layer that's involved in growth, right? As we're going through our formative years, this cellular layer helps the cartilage to grow, and then once we're in our adult years, the cellular layer will help to maintain that cartilage. And so this is known as the perichondrium. So we actually have three different types of cartilage. Not all cartilage is the same. The most abundant we're going to see is the hyaline cartilage. Then we'll take a look at elastic cartilage, and we'll finish up cartilage with fibrocartilage. So as I mentioned before, hyaline cartilage is the most common. Right? This is a tough and somewhat flexible matrix, excuse me. And one of the reasons it's tough, it has a lot of collagen fibers packed within it. So again, we know from previous lessons that collagen provides strength. So where do we see it? It connects your ribs to your sternum. If you were to actually follow your rib around to the front, it doesn't directly touch the sternum, right? To the sides of your sternum, what feels like bone is actually hyaline cartilage, and we call that costal cartilage. The cartilage that keeps our nose shaped the way it is known as nasal cartilage. That is hyaline cartilage. The support cartilage of our respiratory passages, if you were to look at the trachea, the bronchi, we actually have these hyaline cartilaginous rings that keep those tubes open. And then finally, guys, at the end of our long bones, we have what we call articular cartilage, right? And that's the cartilage that you would see, say you had a chicken bone, right? You went to the end of the chicken bone, right? That would be the articular cartilage. And basically that's functioning to reduce the friction between the bones. All right, so if you were to look at hyaline cartilage under the microscope, you would see like a smooth matrix right here, and this is all packed with collagen. Then this kind of purple area out here, this is the lacuna, right? That's going to be the little chamber. And then these here are the individual chondrocytes living in this little cavity over here, right? And again, I just went over the locations. The functions, again, it provides a stiff but flexible support, and it's going to reduce friction, especially between the bones. Right, this is what it looks like an actual micrograph. Again, you can see this would all be the nice matrix. All of this is nice collagen densely packed together. This whole kind of purple area on the outside represents the indentation into the matrix called the lacuna, and then the individual cells are living in the lacuna. This is from another textbook, just kind of showing the same thing. You can see here the matrix, the lacuna, and then in here would be the chondrocytes. And here's actually, look at this, is a great picture. This is magnified 6,000 times. This is a special microscope. So you can see here, see that little cavity right there? All of this cavity, and then here's the chondrocyte living in it, right? The chondrocyte wouldn't survive. It has to live in this little cavity. That would be the lacuna. It's a great picture. The second cartilage is known as elastic cartilage, right? This is a resilient and flexible cartilage. This one contains many elastic fibers. So we know that elastic fibers, we can stretch them and then they recoil back to where they're supposed to be. Some of the places we have them is the auricle of the ear, right? If you kind of just touch the outside of your ear and just, do me a favor, bend it down for a minute and let go. What happens is it pops back up to its normal position. Right, that's because it has elastic fibers. The epiglottis is a piece of cartilage that has elastic fibers. This is what prevents us from choking. When we swallow, the epiglottis goes down, covers our voice box so that food and drink doesn't go into our respiratory system, but then we need to breathe again, so it pops back up because it is elastic cartilage. And then some of the cartilage in our larynx, which is our voice box, also is elastic cartilage. This is something you discuss in, again, future anatomy classes. So this is the auricle of the ear right here, right? So again, if you were to pull this down, it would pop back up. So what we have here again would be lacuna with the chondrocyte living in it. That's the same as hyaline cartilage. But notice, see these little black lines right here? The black lines represent elastic fibers. So that's what gives the cartilage the ability to be stretched, and then it recoils back to normal. So this is what the cartilage would look like in our epiglottis, in the auricle. Again, from another textbook, just to kind of give you an idea. Again, you can, all the black lines right here all represents the elastic cartilage. And so those are, again, the main places: the epiglottis, the auricle. Even this textbook even says part of your ear tube, the eustachian tube, the auditory tube that connects your ear to your throat, is made up of elastic cartilage. This is an extra one. The last cartilage is known as fibrocartilage. Sometimes people call it fibrous cartilage. This is also a very tough and durable cartilage. This contains dense, interwoven collagen fibers. So it's very, very strong. You can definitely see the collagen, when you look at it under the microscope. And this is where, as far as location, what I want you to remember, any disc in the body is going to have fibrocartilage, the intervertebral discs between the vertebrae, the meniscus in the knee, right? There's a medial meniscus, a lateral meniscus. That's fibrocartilage. The pubic symphysis is a fibrocartilaginous disc between the two pubic bones, right? So a great answer always, if I ever ask, is where is fibrocartilage? Any disc in the body. Perfect answer. So here again, they're showing the intervertebral disc. So if you were to look at the microscope, you could actually see the collagen, and they're a little bit more dense, they're more interwoven. Compared to hyaline cartilage, the matrix would be a little bit more smooth. But we have the same things. All cartilage, you would have the lacuna and then the chondrocyte living within it. Right? So any disc in the body, intervertebral disc, the symphysis pubis, the pads within the knee, which are known as the meniscus. Right? And these are really good at resisting compression. And again, that's why they're in the spine, that's why they're in the knee, that type of thing. Excuse me, just from another book, again, you can see the lacuna, which would be the cavity, the chondrocyte living in within it, and again, you can see, again, much more densely packed collagen fibers there. And this book, too, is also showing the disc. Okay. The last connective tissue, finally, right? There's a lot of them, is going to be bone. So in this lesson, I just want to introduce some things about bone. In a future chapter, we're going to do bone in much more detail. So I just want to, again, just kind of give a little bit of an overview. This is definitely a support tissue. It's going to support our body weight, if you think about it. Now, the matrix is hard, and the reason it's hard is because it's calcified, right? We're going to study in future lessons, there are specific types of calcium salts. We'll give them names at that time. But in addition to having calcified salts, there's also collagen within the matrix, which gives the bone some flexibility. Otherwise, our bones would shatter very easily if they were just made of calcium salts. So there is some collagen in there. Now, bone does contain a cell known as not a chondrocyte, but rather an osteocyte. Osteo means bone, and again, cyte means cell. But just like the chondrocyte in cartilage, osteocytes live in little cavities, little chambers that we also call lacuna. Right, so from this lesson, you should definitely know that lacuna is going to exist in both cartilage and bone. And again, they're little cavities that house these cells. Now, the osteocytes are actually organized. They're arranged in kind of these circles around a central canal that does have blood vessels. We're going to see that bone is very vascular. And think about this, right? When you break a bone, it heals, it gets better, and that's because it has a good blood supply. I had mentioned earlier, cartilage doesn't have a good supply, and that's one of the reasons it does not survive. Also interconnecting the osteocytes and just kind of interconnecting the tissue of the bone throughout the bone, we have these small little canals known as canaliculi, right? These are small channels or canals that extend throughout the matrix, and they allow for exchange of material with the blood, the interstitial fluid, and even within the osteocytes. Right? So we're going to look at this in much more detail in future lessons when we study the bone tissue in greater detail. Just like the cartilage had the perichondrium, right? That was the dense, irregular connective tissue around the cartilage. Bone has the same thing, right? It's known as the periosteum this time. And just like the perichondrium, it also can be dissected into two layers. It has an outer fibrous layer and an inner cellular layer, right? That inner cellular layer, again, during our formative years, helps the bone to grow, and then during our adult years it just helps to maintain the bone, or God forbid we do break a bone, the cellular layer will help with repair. So here's a picture from our text showing you, just to kind of give you an idea. We're going to get into this in more detail. This little area here is called the central canal. Notice there's arteries and veins there. Then these little darker areas here, that represents the lacuna where the osteocyte lives. And then see these little lines right here? They look like little cracks in the bone. Those are those little channels that I was talking about called the canaliculi, so that again there can be exchange of materials between the blood and the cells, or between cells to cells. Right? And again, we're going to study this in a little bit more detail down the road. This is what it looks like underneath the microscope. So these dark areas right here represent represent the lacuna where the osteocyte is, right? And this would be the central canal. So you can see it's very organized, right? It's kind of very organized. It reminds me of like if you were to cut a tree down and you see the rings of a tree, right? Same type of thing here. Okay, and this is just our last slide. This is from another textbook showing, again, the osteocytes, central canal. I like this picture here too. They're showing you the osteocyte. It kind of reminds me of an octopus. It has all these arms, and then these are these extensions, and then this is the little canal that I was talking about, the canaliculi. Right, so this little canal right here, and then you see the osteocyte projecting its arm into the canaliculi. And then the osteocyte itself is living in this chamber right here. That's the lacuna. So more on that in more detail in future lessons. So that concludes our connective tissues. Right? In this lesson we had done the blood, the lymph, cartilage, and then we finished up with an overview of bone. Right? More on that in future lessons.